Hello and welcome to another episode of What She Said. I'm your host, Lucy Lucraft. I am a freelance journalist and podcast producer living in Brighton. This week, I chat to Penny Wincer, a freelance photographer, writer, and now brand new author. She wrote her book Tender last year, and it is due to be released in a couple of weeks' time. This is an episode where we delve into the topic of caring, which is what her book is all about. Penny is she's so lovely, first and foremost. She's also really bloody interesting. Her book Tender is all about caring and Penny's role as a carer and how huge swathes of people in the population who are carers and might not even realise it, and how that caring work manifests itself, the joys, the difficulties, the challenges, the nuance. And it's just a really beautiful book. I highly recommend it. So make sure you pre-order your copy. The links to everything will be in the show notes. So I'm giving you a bit of a trigger warning. We don't discuss suicide in detail, but we talk about grief. So if that's a trigger for you, I would recommend not listening. It was a really funny episode. I said I wasn't going to tell anybody this, but we recorded, and I guess both of us I'm really struggling to get back into the swing of kind of interviewing people. And so I really wasn't asking very good questions. And Penny is a consummate professional. But at the end, when we stopped officially talking for the podcast, but we're just chatting, the conversation then started flowing even better than it had in the official kind of podcast recording time. And luckily I was still recording it, so I then have spliced it all up. I just really wanted some of the really interesting things that we talked about after the fact to be in the main podcast. Anyway, enough waffling from me. I say that every week, but this is my podcast and I can waffle if I want to. If you liked the episode, please like, share, subscribe, review, all the things that podcasters ask you to do, because it really does make a difference to us. Doing this podcast is an absolute joy. I love doing it, and I've got a wonderful group of patrons who help me fund this podcast and cover all my business costs by supporting me over there. So if that's something you would like to be part of, then head on over to patreon.com Lucy Lucraft. That's it. Enjoy the episode. It was fascinating and moving, and you write in such an incredible way. First of all, who are you, Penny? Tell us who you are.
Gosh, where do you begin? I am an Australian who's been in London for a very, very long time. I live in South East London. I've got 2 children. I'm a professional photographer, and I have been for probably about 14 or 15 years. And I'm also now an author.
So exciting. How does it feel to say that?
I think that's the first time I've said author out loud. So I would definitely call myself a writer. I've been a writer for a while, but an author, yeah, that sounds really different, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It sounds really grown up. So Penny's written a book. Tell us about your book, Tender.
Tender is about being a carer, and I would say mostly it's about how we look after ourselves while we're supporting somebody else. And it really came about because I have a disabled child, and I felt like the conversations around caring was really limited. We talk about caring in a very surface level way, I think, in society, and the more conversations I had with other carers of all different kinds, not just parents, the more I realised that we had so much in common, and how common our experience was, and how much we needed each other. We needed each other's stories. We needed to tell our stories. And these stories are not really out there. And it is one of the most universal human experiences, like being a parent. Being a carer is something that almost all of us will do at some point.
It was so interesting to me, comparison of being a carer in loads of different ways, and just that you didn't even realize you were a carer. I'd never thought of that before, because I can see that in so many different people, and in my own life, where you've just you are a carer.
This is why the numbers are so challenging to quantify. So I think the official number at the moment in the UK is around 7 million, but actually they think it's more like 9 million plus, because people don't identify as carers. That's actually one of the biggest challenges is actually by the time people identify as carers, they're often in a crisis because they don't realize that's what they're doing. And they don't know that they need to ask for support because nobody's telling you. Nobody gives you support unless you ask for it. And often you have to beg for it and even often go to tribunal to get it. So it's not like they're handing out support left, right and centre. So often people get into a real crisis point, a massive crisis, before any support's given. And obviously at the moment that's likely to get far, far worse. I've checked in with a lot of the carers that I spoke to for the book. Most of them are doing it 24/7 now, completely alone. It's like, it's not sustainable. So I honestly don't know what it's going to mean for people. There's going to be a massive health crisis for carers coming up, I think.
But I think it really has shone a light. Like this has shown everybody, I hope, just what happens when you support a Tory government for this long, because this is what happened.
Yeah, I hope so. God, I hope so. I just felt like, and I wanted something. I was looking for something that was a kind of a deep dive and that was nuanced, that talked about all of the difficult feelings that come up, all of the things that are really hard to talk about with other people, but also all of the joys and the sense of purpose and even a lot of the pleasure in being a carer as well. So I couldn't find it, so I wrote it.
It's the book you wish you could have read, I guess.
I really needed it when my son was first diagnosed when he was 3. And I also really needed it when I was a teenager, when I was caring for my mother. And I didn't know at the time that's what I was doing. I'd never heard the word young carer. When I was I think I probably heard the term for the first time when I was around 30. And she died when I was 22. So it was not a word I would have associated with myself at all. And that's actually the main reason why it's not in the title of the book, because so many people don't associate with the word carer. Most people, when they think of that word, they think of somebody, I think one of my interviewees put it, somebody who cleans up bodily fluids. And that's actually only one very small part of what it might mean to be a carer. For a lot of people, it's not that at all. And caring can be very, it can be just, very little, like a few hours a week here and there. It could be with somebody that you don't actually live with, or it could be really intense and 24 hours a day and involve a lot of personal care. But yeah, so the spectrum is really wide, and I think that's probably part of the reason why it's not really talked about in detail. Sometimes what you'll see is that there, very particular kind of disabilities or illnesses will get talked about in terms of care, but it won't be talked about in the wider context of caring. So you might get books about supporting someone that has cancer or raising an autistic child, or things that very specific things, but actually what I was really interested in was the topic of caring itself.
So when the book starts and you're talking about your son and his diagnosis at I don't know, is it young to be diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, no, I think it's not young. It was on the earlier side, but it's not young for a child or a person that has learning difficulties. And my son is autistic and he has learning difficulties. So he had quite severe developmental delays. And so that's around 2 to 3 is when those kids like that would probably get diagnosed, because that's when the gap really starts to widen between kids with learning difficulties and kids that don't have them. Some autistic kids who don't have learning difficulties, it's just more obvious because some children have a speech delay, which then they catch up around 5 or 6. That's quite common as well. But then there are loads and loads of autistic people who don't get diagnosed until now, until adulthood, and lots of them actually get diagnosed along with their children because, they're realizing their children are having a few issues, and then they're like, oh, I was so similar when I was a child. And then all the pieces start to fall together. So you can be diagnosed at any time, but if there are some particular issues around development, then you're likely to get diagnosed.
So yeah, what I found really interesting was that you did, the fact that you didn't realize that you were a carer for your mum, and that's when it all twigged that you'd done this before. You could do this because you'd done this before. And learning about your childhood was also really fascinating because in many ways it sounded like kind of otherworldly.
It's interesting, actually. I very much feel I had a childhood of two halves. The first half until I was 11 was almost ridiculously idyllic. I still am very close with the three other girls I lived on the street with. We talk about it now that we can't actually quite believe the magical childhood that we had. My mum was very well when I was young. We lived in the far outer suburbs of Melbourne. We had an acre of garden. I lived on a quiet dead end street with everyone else who had an acre of garden. And we had this very free and easy and very happy, secure childhood. And my mum loved being a mother, and she loved being a full-time mother, and she was really thriving when I was young. And then we moved when I was 11 to a farm, which was not that far away. It was only 20 minutes away, but it was just sort of right on the edge of Melbourne. My mum had sort of project managed the whole build while my dad had been overseas and had thrown herself into it, but had been quite reluctant to leave behind this beautiful life that they had created for us. But we moved to the farm, and then things really started to fall apart for her. And I think it was compounded. It wasn't caused by the move by any means, but it was compounded by the isolation of being away from the community that my mum had created around us as well.
Yeah, two halves is exactly the right way to describe it. And you were really quite young.
I was, and my mum started to get unwell when I was 11. She started to have panic attacks, but it really wasn't until I was about 13 that she really, really started to have a full, proper breakdown, which meant she was not able to function at all. And at that point, we left the farm and we were living in the suburbs, and it was much easier because I could walk myself to the train station to get to school, things like that. So I was able to be independent. So we moved somewhere I could be independent because I was completely dependent. When we moved to the suburbs, I really thought, oh, well, things will get much better now because I can be independent and Mum won't have to get in the car all the time and she'll be near friends again and all these sorts of things. But actually the opposite happened. She went really, really downhill. And really from about 13, we were having to kind of pretty much look after ourselves at that point. And we were very, very lucky. My mum did get some help in. She had a really wonderful woman who was an ex-mental health nurse come in a few times a week and be, I guess, like a paid carer for my mum for a few hours, but also to kind of be like tidy the house and maybe cook a meal and stick it in the fridge for us and things like that. So we had someone checking in on us. And my parents were divorced by this point and my dad was living in America. So he was coming back and checking in with us, but he wasn't around, if you know what I mean. He wasn't in the house and he wasn't around for, months and months at a time. I'm not sure anyone really quite realised the severity of the situation until later. We weren't alone. We were definitely not alone. I have two aunts, my mum's sisters, who we're very close to. And people were checking in on us, but I really think people didn't understand quite the severity of what was going on, that we were just looking after ourselves. And I think there were periods where my mum wouldn't be out of bed for 2 weeks. And we just got on with it, I suppose.
I think there's something about, my sister also died by suicide. And I think something that people probably don't always understand is that it's not a deep dive. It's not like fine one day, not the next. It's, incremental little, well, I mean, I can't speak exactly to your experience, but I think there's similarities in that there's incremental steps. And when you're in it, I mean, hindsight is wonderful, but when you're in it, you don't necessarily see every little step as it's happening.
Absolutely. And also, you can't know what's going on inside somebody. I think you really can't know. And from our point of view, I think in our family, it was very cyclical. So my mum would become very, very unwell, be in bed for weeks. I'd be sitting by her bedside every night and she'd be crying on my shoulder every night for weeks on end, telling me things I really shouldn't have known at 13, as you can imagine. And eventually it would get to a crisis and she would go into hospital and have medication changes and be watched for a while. and stay there for 2 weeks and come out again and be really hopeful and really positive and really gung-ho and might be great for a month or two and then slowly descend again. And this was a cycle that happened over and over again until she died.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that it was always bad. And I think that's the thing that's kind of hard to explain to someone. You go through really great periods. And also my mum was very self-aware and really articulate and very open about her experiences with me. So we did a lot of this processing of what was going on together when she was well, and then things would descend again. And looking back now, I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful that she was able to be so articulate about her experiences with me, because I think if she had hidden them from me more, I wouldn't have understood quite as much when she died. And I think not knowing what she had experienced would have been much harder than knowing what she experienced, even though it was really painful to know how difficult things have been.
Do you know Julia Samuels?
Yes, I do.
Something that she says is, especially with children and bereavement. So my dad died when I was younger, and so I've experienced bereavement as like a young adult and as someone older, and definitely, and in fact, it's kind of universal, to be honest, but specifically for children, not telling them things means that because people are doing it because they want to be kind, and especially if people die in not as easy to explain kind of way, parents or adults will strive to, I don't know, protect children and make it not hurt. And Julia says, well, that's ridiculous, you can't make them not feel sad. You just can't. But what happens when you don't tell them the truth is that they fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
And what you fill in the blanks with is always so, so much worse than anything that could happen in reality. And I really think that's true. And I think it's true for adults as well, but particularly as a child.
Yeah, I think that's really, really true. And actually, I'm very open with my daughter, who's 8 now, about the fact that her grandmother died by suicide. And it's not easy to talk about because, to be able to articulate to a young child that sometimes people feel so bereft that they can't continue. But the way I've explained it to her is that my mother was very ill. She couldn't help it. It was like it's like a symptom of a sickness, and it's not something you can control. And that doesn't mean it's inevitable, because with the right support, most people can avoid suicide. It's not inevitable, but at the same time, it's nobody's fault, and it's not always controllable. Yeah. And I think it's really important to have these conversations. I think a lot about how different things would have been for me if my mother had died younger. So my mum had a very, very bad year when I was 14. It was a really bad year, and she attempted suicide, I think, a couple of times. Definitely one time that I 100% knew about. I think there were other times that were hidden from me. And I think I've thought a lot over the years about the fact that actually she could very well have died that year. And in fact, she probably should have died that year, in terms of things could have very easily gone that way. And that would have been a really different experience for me, incredibly different, because the time between 14 and 22, although some of those years were incredibly difficult, we also had some really, really wonderful times, but also we had a lot of time to process what she had gone through together. And I learnt so much between 14 and 22 about mental illness and about what my mum experienced, to the point that I think the difference for me, losing my mother at those two different ages, would have been completely and utterly different, even though it would have been the same, end result. And I think that's to do with how well my mum was able to process things with me and not afraid to process things with me.
Do you think that's a bit of a kind of universal experience of carers as well? Because even when you're, I don't want to compare all caring to grief, but I think sometimes because that's incredibly problematic, but in some senses there's parts of grief that are universal to living experiences that we have, as in heartbreak or people changing, or even coronavirus.
Yeah.
People are experiencing it, this whole global pandemic, and how our world is changing as, how we would experience grief.
Yeah, I think that was so interesting to really get into in the book, this idea about grief. And the word grief is so associated with death, but it's not entirely about death, though. It's about loss, and loss can be anything, and loss can even be abstract. But I think the word grief itself is really difficult to use in other kinds of losses sometimes, because it can feel a bit like a betrayal to use a word that's associated with death along with a different kind of loss. But, that's the English language. Unfortunately, there isn't another word that describes those feelings, which are so raw when you lose something that you either thought you had or you did have. There's quite a big divide often in the disabled community between parent carers and disabled people, and some of the language that's used. A lot of parents of disabled children experience a huge amount of grief when their children are first diagnosed. And many people have an issue with that, with the word grief being used in that context, because their children have not died. But they have lost something. And although it's really hard to, how do I put this? It's really hard to articulate what that loss is when it's abstract, because you haven't actually lost it. You've lost the idea of it. No matter what you say consciously, your subconscious has probably made a whole lot of expectations when you have a child that you may not even realize it. And one of them was that I would have a child that could speak. And so being faced with a situation in which I wasn't sure if my son would ever speak, I had to really process those feelings and that feeling of loss. It is a really difficult thing to talk about, because what exactly did I lose? I didn't lose anything, because he didn't have it in the first place. But what I lost was the idea of a child who could tell me when they're in pain. The child that could tell you that their stomach hurt and we had to go to hospital because they had appendicitis. That's like one of my biggest fears, is that my son will experience something acute and not be able to explain it, because it's not just that he doesn't have the words, it's also that he's not very good at indicating. So if he has I've never ever known in his life if he's had a headache, because he can't indicate internal pain to me. So I've had to accept the things that come along with having a child that doesn't speak. And that can be really, really challenging to articulate without implying that you don't want the child that you got. Because, I adore the child I have. I absolutely adore him. I don't want him to be different. But there's still a letting go that has to happen in order to fully embrace the life that we have. And yeah, it's a really challenging thing to articulate without hurting anybody.
Yeah, because I think, motherhood, man.
Yeah.
There's, it's a minefield. I think we walk such a tightrope, basically, of I'm so grateful, but also this is really hard and I need to say it out loud, and I don't like this part, but I also love all the other parts. And I think that's pretty much motherhood in a nutshell.
It is,
and then
yeah.
if you add any other, any other deviation from, quote unquote normal, man, it gets so much harder. I actually wanted to ask you about the disabled community, because I suppose from the age that Arthur was 3, you were thrown into a new community alongside motherhood, and how that's been, and finding support. And you talk a lot on Instagram about all the difficulties and the joys, but the difficulties that carers are facing right now, and especially when it comes to the political climate. And how was that for you when Arthur first got diagnosed?
Well, I think the problem is at first you don't know there's a community. You have no idea. And you've got to find it. And that is the really, really challenging bit when either somebody first becomes disabled or a loved one becomes disabled or born disabled. You know, it's not like there's an NCT group that you go to. I think there's also this misconception that when your child gets diagnosed, you get a huge amount of support. That might be the case in some disabilities and chronic illnesses. It is not the case with autism. It is 100% not the case with autism. We have a fantastic local autism support group, which I did tap into early on, and I met some fantastic women who I'm still friends with today, and we still have the WhatsApp group going. But that took a little while to tap into. But in terms of support, I mean, I really got nothing. There's no kind of, for a developmental disorder, because it sort of taps into quite a few different areas, you don't really get anyone coordinating the care at all. You are that person. You're the one that now has to be the expert. You're the one that now has to liaise with the speech therapist and an occupational therapist, if you're lucky enough to get any, which we actually weren't. I had to pay privately for occupational therapy. I was the one who had to research whether it was worth paying for occupational therapy, because nobody was there to tell me, and actually occupational therapy does wonders for kids with sensory difficulties. You should, if you've got any money, that's what you should spend it on. There's nobody there telling you that. You have no idea. You're very much on your own. So that's the massive challenge, I think, is finding that community. And also the online world is a minefield of absolute fucking shit especially about autism, as you can imagine. So wading through all of that information is exhausting. So you're coming to terms with the new diagnosis, you're a full-time carer to this child you're now realizing is going to need potentially really high levels of support, possibly forever. And then you've got so much information available to you, and you have no idea where any of it has any value at all. The sooner we can kind of lock into real life community, but also one-to-one community online, I think the better it is. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, because actually, for a parent, it's one thing to find that community. I think parents generally are pretty well tapped into communities online and in real life. It's much harder for other groups of people. I think some of the hardest, it's for people in their 20s and 30s who are caring for another family member, because it's a more unusual situation to be in. If you're in your 20s and 30s, most of your friends are traveling, doing new jobs, getting married, having children. And if you are supporting a partner or a parent who's very disabled or very ill, and you're doing it at very high levels, you're in a really isolated position because you're very separated from your peers. There aren't drop-in groups for people in their 20s who are looking after a parent with Alzheimer's. It's really difficult. And I think that's where online communities have been absolutely fantastic, and the online world for both disabled people and for carers. I think the online world has been an absolute godsend because people are able to find each other. I met and spoke to people who found other carers through hashtags with very rare diseases. So they would just put a hashtag in front of the rare disease of the person that they care for, and they were able to find other people who are supporting people who had similar experiences. Finding that community, it takes time. You have to wade through often a lot of really awful misinformation. But having that community is absolutely vital, because I think we all need to feel like we have a place we can go, whether that's online or in real life, where we don't have to explain our backstory all the time. And we also don't want to be in a position where we're constantly pitied, because there's absolutely nothing worse than talking about something really normal that happens in your house and just see the look of shocked faces all around you. It is just so incredibly isolating and painful to see that your experiences are not reflected in anyone else's. Part of the reason we need that community is just so that we don't feel so alone in our experiences. And the thing is, we aren't alone. Being a carer is a very, very common experience, really, really common. And there are lots of us out there to connect with. I remember before my son was diagnosed and my daughter was born, and that's when things got really challenging. So around the time he was 2 and my daughter was born, and I would go and meet up with some friends who had children of very similar ages, and they would all be going, oh gosh, it's really thank God it's getting easier. Thank God it's getting easier. And I just remember thinking, it's getting harder. It's getting harder. There's something wrong with me because it's just getting harder. And I just couldn't relate at all to anything any of the other parents were saying. I mean, nothing. And that was actually one of the most difficult things, I think, at the time, was feeling like your experience was nothing like anyone else's around you.
It must have been incredibly isolating. There's a sense with motherhood that you're going a bit mad sometimes, and that either everybody's lying to you or exaggerating or whatever. So I actually got picked up on something once by a friend who is disabled, and I'd said my online friends are my in real life friends, and she said, actually, you know, I can't easily make in real life friends. My online friends are my in real life friends and categorizing them as something different from the norm is really ableist, because that online support is, I mean, sometimes it is the only support.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationships that I've developed online or through communities where we don't see each other all the time have been incredibly rich and incredibly life-giving. And also I live in a country that I wasn't born, so I have very close friends still in Melbourne who I would say are still my closest friends, some of them. But our relationship is not, in real life. I mean, I don't even know when I'm going to see them again at this point. You know, Australia's borders are closed. It could be a very long time before I see any of them in person. But yeah, we can have a very rich relationship online, and even with the people that I've never met in person, actually. And especially writing this book, which has been just such an amazing experience of connecting with other carers. And that was actually one of the most brilliant things about writing it. I got to have the most incredible, intimate conversations with people who are doing incredible things, some really, really challenging things, and they're all leading really rich and varied lives. And my life has been so much richer for knowing them and knowing their stories. Because of course, if you can't see it, if you can't picture yourself doing something, you probably won't try and go for it. But it's not like that's the only reason you get it.
I feel so, I don't know, like tempted to just dive in and start trying to manifest things.
I just think it's so twisted, isn't it? Because so this book is, I think, a really good example. One of the reasons why this book has happened quite easily, I was really particularly worried about talking about disability as a non-disabled person. I had to be talking about caring, and I could talk about disability, but I couldn't ever talk about it like I knew exactly what it was, because I am not disabled, so I can't speak from that kind of point of view at all. But, you know, one of the reasons why this book is out there with a mainstream publisher is because I am not a disabled person. I'm white. I'm middle class. I'm very digestible. Like, I don't think I'm too challenging for people. I think a lot of disabled people have written some things that are very similar, and they find it harder to get out there. It almost stopped me from writing it, you know, and I think that's what stops a lot of people from writing about really challenging topics, is because, you know, I had a huge fear that I was going to fuck it up really badly, that I was going to talk about things that I wasn't in a position to talk about. I had to keep that in my mind the entire time, that what my position was and what I can have an opinion about and what I need to constantly defer to other people for. And so I interviewed a number of people, some professionals like Frances Ryan, who's a fantastic writer, and she wrote an amazing book called Crippled last year, which is about the state of disability in the UK at the moment, and it's a shocking read, but really, really important read. It was really important to me that there were disabled voices in the book. I never wanted to talk on behalf of anybody else. I wanted to talk about my experiences of carer, and then share other stories of carers, and then share some as well of the stories of being cared for and being supported. I just wanted to make sure that I got it. It's never going to be perfect. I'm sure I will be challenged on some of the ideas in the book, because actually some of the ideas of the book are not comfortable. But I at least felt comfortable when I handed it all over, the final draft, that I think at this point I've got it as close, I hope, as I can to the ideas that I wanted to get across.
Let's talk about your book a little bit. I'd love to know how it came about, and what the process is like. I think there's something really, I know we fetishize writing a little bit. I say we, I don't mean me and you. I
mean, in general, we do.
In general.
We do. Well, I'm going to say something that's going to annoy everybody, in that it was an absolute pleasure to write from start to finish, and I absolutely loved it, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat from start to finish. It was such a joy. It was such a joy. It came about, I'd started working on a fiction thing, but I just couldn't get out of my head some of these ideas that I wanted to talk about, which have ended up in the book. And about 18 months ago, it was only about 18 months ago, I was home in Australia visiting my family and friends, and for a very quick trip, I go without my children because my son can't travel, and so I just go for like a week and do a very quick trip, blitz everybody, see everyone, and then fly back again. And I saw one of my oldest friends, who we grew up on the same street together, Lucy, who's in the book. Her mother, Ray, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 10 or 12 years ago now. It was early onset. And we were sitting there over a glass of red wine. We haven't seen each other in person for like 2 years. Having a good old laugh about the fact that looking after my son and her supporting her mum some days actually looks very, very similar. And we were having a laugh about some of the, a few, which I won't go into, experiences that we have had as carers that were very, very similar. And it just at that point really struck me that, you know what, I'm interested in, I don't want to talk to other parents with autistic kids particularly. It doesn't, like, I didn't want to write just about my son. I didn't want to write about autism. I'm not autistic. I don't want to write about autism. But what I realised was that, you know what, I've been a carer a couple of times, and I really love talking to other carers about their experiences, and actually that is what I want to write about, and that's what I don't read about. That's what I can't find. The only books I've ever found on carers really have been very practical, but you know, it was a different kind of thing I was after. I was after like a real deep dive into the really challenging and very kind of diverse and often oppositional emotions that come up in the act of caring for somebody else. And so I came back from that trip and I thought, right, I'm going to write a book proposal. I'm just going to get it out of my head. And I think I did the proposal in January and February last year, so 2019. I'm a photographer, which is quite seasonal, so January and February are quite quiet for me. So I thought, right, okay, I'm going to knuckle down, do the proposal. Gave myself the end of February as a deadline. At the end of February, I had a contact at one particular publisher that I decided to go see because this editor was really lovely. Right away, she was like, yep, I want to meet you. And we had a great meeting. But in the end, I decided to go ahead and get an agent. And I had a few that I was interested in that I'd just been keeping a little bit of an eye on that had interesting lists. I met with a few and chose one who is my agent, Abigail Bergstrom, who is just divine. And she read the proposal. She got back to me right away and she was just like, I can completely see this. I want to meet you. And the thing that was so exciting about the interest that came up with agents was that I could see that this was definitely something that was interesting to people outside of my world. Because when Abigail and I started talking, you know, she has not really any particularly direct experience with it. She's young. She's got a very dynamic list of authors who are all mostly activists and feminists. And I just knew right away she understood a lot of the challenges with the book, and that she could see that it was necessary, and she could see it was a conversation that wasn't happening. And that made me really, really excited. So, we did a little bit of tweaking of the proposal, sent it out, had a lot of interest, had a preempt, which I turned down. So that's when somebody gives an offer right away for you to take it off the table and take it away from everybody else. Wow. So that was really exciting. Again, it just showed that there was an appetite for this kind of book, which, you know, wasn't really out there. And then I accepted an offer in the middle of the year, handed it in Christmas.
And the rest is history. Oh, incredible.
Yeah, it was very fast. It was very fast. So I'd say I wrote it between September and December,
Wow,
essentially.
that's fast.
But it was such a pleasure. It was so enjoyable. It was so enjoyable.
Oh, it's really nice to hear somebody talk about something that, yeah, it is only talked about in sort of not negative terms, but in, yeah, it'd be amazing to have a book, but, you know, oh, it's a chore to write. And actually, you know, I'm a writer and I don't love writing. I mean, I do. I do. I love pitching. I don't love the first draft. I like editing. I like pitching and editing. I like coming up with the ideas and then editing them.
Yeah, I don't know what it's going to be like, the next project, you know, in terms of like, I don't know if I suspect this is not going to be a typical experience for me. I think it was the right time for me. It was a pleasure because I love doing all the interviews. That was absolutely just so wonderful to just dive into this topic for about an hour and a half or so, or 2 hours sometimes with a person, record it, and then have to interpret people's stories and take out the bits from the stories that are going to kind of fit together. Because in the book, the way I've divided the chapters are kind of by topics that were interesting to me, essentially. And then I found different interviews, and I've used other people's stories and my own to illustrate some of the topics I wanted to talk about. So I've sort of woven together lots of different stories. Some of them I go into quite a bit of detail, and others I just touch on one small aspect of their story. And each of the people I spoke to just had the most incredible stories. And it was just such a pleasure to speak to them and understand more about their lives and to learn from them. I learned from every single one of them about different things that they were going through and different ways that they were coping. And then, yeah, it was like, I guess, putting a puzzle together, but it was probably more like quilting, I think, you know, like trying to decide how much of my story to use, where different pieces of other people's story we're going to weave in and illustrate the kind of things I wanted to talk about. And also there's a lot of research in it as well, and theory that kind of talks about some of the broader ideas. And so I interviewed a few professionals as well and read loads of books. So it was a real pleasure, actually. Yeah.
I was thinking when I was reading it that you should have a podcast.
Well, I mean, I did initially think I would do a podcast to go with the launch of the book. And even if it was only like a 6-part something, to kind of dive a little bit deeper into each, maybe 6 different stories.
Yeah.
Gosh, with everything that was going on, I actually made the decision not to start a new medium at this time because it would have also meant promoting the podcast as well as promoting the book and things like that. And so, I mean, I love podcasts. I'm an absolute kind of audio junkie. I listen to audiobooks, a lot of audiobooks, and I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think it's such an incredible medium. It's such an incredible medium for intimate stories as well, and these are very intimate stories in the book. So it's I wouldn't rule it out for the future, but yeah, I decided actually for this year, the way everything's gone this year, it was probably adding a little bit too much of a challenge to my plate.
Yeah. You've got enough on your plate, I think. So I have one last question to ask you, Penny, and it is, what is your signature dish?
Oh goodness. I'm going to go with roast chicken.
Talk us through your roast chicken.
I use a recipe from a River Cottage book that I've had for like 10 or 12 years, and it's so easy. You basically slather the chicken in butter and squeeze loads of lemon onto it and then throw it in the oven, and it's so easy and delicious. And the reason I love it is because obviously I really enjoy eating roast chicken, but I love making chicken stock and having chicken soup afterwards and stuff. So that's actually the real reason why I roasted chicken, is so that I can have the stock afterwards.